Well, morning all. It's good to see so many people on the call. Just give it 30 seconds to tick over to maybe when it passed to make sure everybody's on the call. And it's looking good so far. Hi, Caroline. Hey, Paul. Rachel.
Hi, Tracy.
Morning. Okay, we'll get started. It's going to be a packed programme this morning, and on the day that the vaccine is rolled out, the government certainly are talking about the future and not the past. This is about fairness, and as our colleagues across the north have said, it is injustice on an industrial scale. And we know, don't we, that other countries in Europe have supported freelancers and excluded much better than ours. Today is a really great meeting, and it's going to be quite an exciting week for excluded. We have mayors with us today, so welcome Dan, I see he's already on the call. But also we have Margaret's debate in the Westminster Hall tomorrow at 4:30, and also we have our meeting with the Minister on Thursday. So this is quite a good week, and I'm looking forward to putting more pressure on the government. Just a bit of housekeeping. We have members of the press with us today, so welcome to you all. They will be able to see the chat, so be nice in the chat box. Also, if I could give apologies from Jonathan Reynolds, Bill Stern, Stella Creasy, Jay Stone sadly is unwell, and Jerry Donaldson, and also just to let you know that Steve Rotheram is joining us at 11. Then we'll, after Steve, take a short comfort break, and then Andy Burnham will be with us at 11:45. So as I say, it's a really big week, and just to thank all the hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people who have been campaigning. Actually, they are also really struggling and coping with so much else. Poverty, anxiety, stress, house moves, job losses, and so on. All the APPG represents Forgotten PYE, Forgotten Limited, Maternity Petition, Excluded UK, New Starter Justice, Refused Furlough Support Group, and all of those individuals that may not even know there's a group that represents them, but have been calling their MPs or councillors to try and get some justice. So let's kick off. We're going to hear from the wonderful Dan Jarvis, Mayor of Sheffield, in a moment, and take questions to Dan. And would say he's an extraordinary human being, and not only the Member of Parliament for Barnsley Central 2011, but also elected Mayor of Sheffield. I don't know how he does both jobs, but he is an extraordinary person. And at the beginning of the first national lockdown, we know that Dan wrote to Chancellor calling for extended support for those who would otherwise fall through the cracks. He has been a campaigner on the issue relentlessly for self-employed workers. Also, he was part of the letter, is my understanding, to all the mayors to Rishi Sunak as well. And it's estimated 68,000 individuals in South Yorkshire have been excluded, but we're going to hear much more from Dan himself. So the floor is yours, Dan, and thank you so much for taking the time today to join us.
Well, thank you, Tracy, for that wonderful introduction. It's great to see you, and great to see so many colleagues on the call this morning. It's also, of course, a real pleasure to join my counterparts from Liverpool and Manchester, and I look forward to hearing what they've got to say later on. I'd also like to take the opportunity to speak about the situation in South Yorkshire, but also to thank you and your team for the vital work that the APPG is doing to support those who've been left out in the cold for the past 9 months or so. Now, we used to hear that coronavirus doesn't discriminate, but as we all now know, that sentiment couldn't be further from the truth, because the fact is that the health and economic impact of this wretched disease has not been shared equitably. I'd like to say from the outset, and I think it's only fair to make the point, that nobody expected the government to get everything right in March. There was no blueprint for the economic response to a public health crisis of this scale, nor I don't think is anyone saying that the Treasury has simply sat on its hands during the crisis. At its peak, the coronavirus job retention scheme supported 9.6 million jobs, while the self-employed income support scheme was accessed by at least 2.6 million workers. The issue is that despite being consistently warned about the significant holes in the system, the government has failed to act and plug those holes. To make matters worse, and as the Resolution Foundation noted, that support hasn't been effectively targeted. Now, the government has paid out around 1.3 billion through the self-employment income support scheme to thriving businesses who just didn't need it. That is a huge kick in the teeth to those who haven't been able to access anything, but who are in desperate need. We're not talking about small numbers either. The National Audit Office estimates that 2.9 million people are ineligible for support. That is 10% of the UK workforce. And the stories behind these statistics are absolutely heartbreaking. I joined Andy Burnham and Steve Rotheram and Andy Street, to be fair, at an event last week organised by Excluded UK and Forgotten Limited, where we heard about the impact this is having on working people and their families. Households are being driven into debt and poverty. Children are suffering with poor mental health, and it would be devastating at any time, but of course, made more so with Christmas just around the corner. So I'd like to read what one of my constituents here in South Yorkshire had to say, which I think poignantly sums up how the left behind feel. My constituent was newly self-employed, so didn't qualify for the self-employed scheme, then had their universal credit application rejected. This is what they wrote. I'll be paying for all of this for the rest of my working life, yet I will see no personal benefit. I've worked since I was 13 years of age. I was paying tax at 17 years old, and I have never not had a job till now. I've done everything right my whole life, yet still I am left with nothing. Well, this morning's focus is rightly on the regional aspect of this problem. I say rightly because COVID has hit the north of England particularly hard. The brutal reality is, rather than levelling up, we're on course for a painful period of levelling down. In South Yorkshire, the level of people claiming unemployment-related benefits is now higher than at any time since the grim aftermath of the pit closures. While this is a cause for great concern, it is in no way surprising. And that's because the UK is one of the most regionally unequal in the developed world. Shamefully, if you live in the north, you are more likely to earn less and die younger. COVID has exacerbated these disparities. And one of the technocratic issues we've faced with this is a lack of available data for our region. So it can be difficult to identify precisely who is falling through the cracks. But we estimate that there are around 68,000 people in South Yorkshire who are currently excluded from support. We know they are more likely to be freelancers and the recently self-employed, most of whom are not particularly well paid in the best of times. In South Yorkshire, we have more than 18,000 self-employed workers in the accommodation, retail and leisure sectors. That's 1 in 4 of our self-employed workforce in the region operating in the worst hit industries. In terms of the recently self-employed, our region has the highest proportion, that's 13.1% of our self-employed workforce who've started up in the previous year. That's 10,000 people who, through no fault of their own, haven't been able to access the self-employed scheme. And of course, those who haven't been going for very long are also less likely to be able to draw on wages and profits. So in terms of what the government can do to help, well, there's plenty that the government can do, because it isn't just where people have been left out, but also about whole industries that haven't been given the support that they need. So as the Mayor, my team are looking at how we can top government grants, because simply put, they don't cover the losses caused by the restrictions imposed. Businesses in areas that were put into Tier 2 and then into Tier 3 prior to the national lockdown in November have received unfair and disproportionately lower levels of support compared to those in other areas that had little or no restrictions before heading into national lockdown. For example, even though businesses and residents in South Yorkshire spent 10 days in Tier 2 and then a further 12 days in Tier 3, the 30 million from the additional restrictions grant we were allocated is the same on a per capita basis as that which was given to all tier 1 areas. It's a deeply unfair arrangement, and we calculate that South Yorkshire should have had an additional 12.8 million and a further 2.6 million from the local restrictions support grant. That's why I've been calling for an extension and a top up of the ARG to help businesses and individuals in South Yorkshire who need additional support to get through these challenging winter months. Take the hospitality and accommodation sectors as an example. Some venues make 40% of their annual profits between Halloween and January, and it's clear that losing out on the valuable Christmas trading period may be a blow that many businesses simply won't be able to recover from. In total, over 44,000 businesses operating these sectors in Yorkshire and the Humber have been directly impacted. That's 20% of the business base in our region. Targeted support for businesses in the supply chain for these sectors can't be overlooked either. We also need the government to reconsider the grant levels across all schemes to ensure they reflect the reality of business costs. This is especially true for businesses with rateable values above £51,000. Now, I think groups such as Excluded UK and Forgotten Limited have put forward some very well thought through policy proposals, particularly on the newly self-employed, freelancers and limited company directors. The problems with universal credit are well documented. Easier and quicker access to money is, of course, essential. And we know that half of all households visiting food banks struggle to afford food and clothes because they were repaying universal credit debts. So even for those who have access to universal credit, it simply isn't doing the job. An idea that was voted by Andy Burnham at last week's event that's been picked up by our Shadow Treasury team is reallocating the 1.3 billion business rates relief returned to the Treasury from Tesco, Morrisons and Sainsbury's. Why can't the extra cash required to help areas in need, such as South Yorkshire, come from that rebate? Those companies have done the right thing and the government should follow their example. Vaccine or no vaccine, if we don't get help to those individuals and businesses soon, it could well be too late. And this brings me to the point that I always try to reinforce. This isn't just about the short-term harm done today to workers and businesses, but about the long-term harm done tomorrow and beyond to our regional economies. We need our self-employed workers, freelancers and small businesses to thrive if we're going to stand a chance of getting back on our feet. It's why in South Yorkshire, our aim has been to support those businesses that have fallen through the cracks of the National Support Scheme. We've focused on non-rate paying businesses in the hospitality, accommodation, leisure and entertainment sectors, targeting support at businesses forced to close and those who have remained open but have been trading under severe conditions. We're also helping businesses in the supply chain of sectors forced to close due to restrictions, self-employed businesses with fixed property costs, and we've allocated discretionary funds to our local authorities to spend as they see fit. Cash that's gone to businesses, people and places that are bearing the brunt. And we're continuously reviewing the support available and will of course provide as much as we are able. So for our part as mayors, we're doing everything that we can to help our communities, but we can't do it alone. The Chancellor promised that he would do whatever it takes to help us through this crisis, but we know it hasn't worked out that way. More needs to be done, and urgently. I'd like to finish, Tracy, by making a broader point about regional inequality. I welcome the government's acknowledgement of the need to level up, but the Levelling Up Fund announced in the spending review left much to be desired. To put this £4 billion fund into context, it replaces the Local Growth Fund and other sources of funding like the Towns Fund. But it will invest just a mere 600 million next year, which is only 40% of the annual average amount of the Local Growth Fund alone. Similarly, a 220 million pilot of the UK Shared Prosperity Fund is just approximately 10% of what would be needed to replace the annual funding we would have expected to receive from the EU structural funds for the period 2021 to 2027. So, as I said at the start, the brutal reality is that rather than levelling up, South Yorkshire is on course for a painful period of levelling down. We can't let that happen. So, my final message to everyone is keep fighting, keep lobbying, and make sure that your voice is heard. The government might not yet have changed its mind, but the excluded do now have its ear. Thank you once again for inviting me this morning.
Well, thank you, Dan. What an absolutely fantastic presentation. Do you have a few moments to take questions?
Of course,
or
yes.
Or to whiz off? Okay, great. And if anybody read the IPPR report yesterday, it's salutary reading, because everything that Dan has been saying is absolutely true. And I would say that women particularly take the heaviest hit when it comes to that unfairness and inequality. My concern, Dan, if I may start the questions, and if I encourage, if the members of the press are on this call, if you pop your question in the chat bar, I'll ask Dan. But if us raise their hand, and I will hopefully see you and come to you. But my question is, you are doing a brilliant job understanding the challenge, but the money that you are supporting the excluded and PAY freelancers and others with, is that then going to impact further down the line when we get to potentially a very difficult spring?
Well, I think that's a very good question, Tracy. At the beginning of the pandemic, the Metro Mayors were commissioned by senior government ministers, the Prime Minister, the Chancellor, Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government, to draw together economic recovery plans for our areas. And that's what we've done. So the Metro Mayors work very closely together on a cross-party basis. But for our own regions that we represent, we've drawn together individual economic recovery plans. It was, however, really frustrating and concerning that in the spending review that took place last week, the Chancellor didn't seem to want to invest any resources in those plans that have been drawn up at a local and regional level. So I know that I speak for all of the mayors in the work that we've done. We've worked very closely with our local authority partners, with anchor institutions across our region, with the private sector, with our local enterprise partnerships, with a range of different businesses to put in place plans that will give us the best possible chance to build back better and actually begin the long process of seeking to recover from this seismic economic shock that our economy has suffered. I think what we need to see from the government is much more effectively targeted support to ensure that there aren't sectors of the economy that have been left behind. We all know what those sectors are. We all know that there needs to be a further effort from the government to provide support and to do that as quickly as possible. But for that to be targeted in the most effective way and for it to have that kind of wider economic benefit in our regions, it's really important that the government seek to work very closely with Metro Mayors and with local authority leaders. One of the concerning points about the creation of the new Levelling Up Fund is that it won't be directly routed through combined mayoral authorities. The government, rightly in my view, and I know that you have a close interest in this as well, have created new devolved arrangements. We've now set up combined mayoral authorities with mayors who could stand up and fight for their areas. And that is a hugely positive development. But what we need to see from government is now to invest and nurture those devolved arrangements that are in place. Because when it comes to our local economies, we know where the challenges are and we know where the opportunities are. And nobody in Westminster or Whitehall can possibly have that kind of fingertip knowledge to know where that support is best required. And that's why I really do appeal to the government and particularly to the Treasury to work with a range of different organisations, of course, but please seek to work carefully and closely with the Metro Mayors, because we think that we offer the solutions to the huge economic challenges that currently we face.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dan. And you're absolutely right that it can't all be decided in Whitehall, Westminster, because we know our communities much better than strangers in the south. Just to focus, though, on something that you said about the solutions, because with our meeting on Thursday, I think it's important if from this meeting we could also get out a raft of solutions that we can put to ministers, because obviously it's going to be easier for them to climb down the hill if we offer something that can be carried out. Certainly, I know that the tax rebate idea for the PAYE freelancers, also the money from supermarkets is very welcome, but also unused furlough that has been returned to government is a potential pot of money as well. So we're trying to stay solution focused on this meeting as well. So thank you for your positivity. Caroline, you'd like to ask a question?
Thank you very much, and thanks, Dan. That was a really kind of powerful picture that we know is replicated up and down the country. And I suppose my question, in a sense, is not necessarily one that you will know the answer to in a way, but I wondered if you had any insight from where you're sitting as to why the Treasury is quite so resistant to doing what you've described, what we all want to see. In the sense that, I mean, you've said that it's 10% of the workforce. This isn't just like a tiny number that have somehow been overlooked by mistake. And you'll know that there are people who've stood up in Parliament from all sides of the House, not just the opposition, but plenty from government benches too. Mel Stride is the chair of the Treasury Select Committee, again, making really powerful cases on this. And I just wish I understood, and I just wonder if you have any insight. Does it just simply come down to money? And is that the only solution that we can do, is try and find these pots, as you and Tracy have suggested? Or is there some kind of failure to understand in the Treasury what the picture of employment is like in the UK today? Because I get the impression sometimes the government still thinks that the self-employed are kind of people who are doing this as a bit of money on the side, a bit of extra. It's not actually what puts the bread and butter on the table. Whereas, as we know, for so many people, it absolutely is. So I guess I'm kind of asking you a kind of psychological question about what on earth is going on in Rishi Sunak's head.
Well, I think, Caroline, that's a very good question. Look, I share your analysis of the situation. I think there is a kind of concern that we all share, that the Treasury appears to have a blind spot when it comes to these particular sectors of the economy. It's particularly disappointing because, as you rightly say, on a cross-party basis, a number of people have championed this cause for some time and done it very clearly and with kind of great kind of skill. I think, and I hope certainly, that the Treasury is now listening in a way that they weren't previously. And that's why I think meetings and gatherings like this are really important. I think the debate coming up is another really important opportunity to reinforce the points that a number of us have been making for some time. I do get a sense that the Treasury is now more alive to the concerns than they were previously. And therefore, I think we've just got to keep going. I think we've got to take every opportunity to continue to press the case. I think we've got to take every opportunity to try and kind of engage with Treasury ministers and get them to act. I don't think it is about, we all know, the government have been under huge pressure in terms of having to make lots of decisions. The public finances have been stretched in a way that, we haven't seen in our lifetime. So none of this is easy, but there does appear to be a blind spot here. And I think we've all got to keep going and continue kind of pressing the case and hope and work to ensure that the government listen and act urgently, because everybody understands, the situation is urgent for millions of people around the country. So we've got to keep going.
Thank you.
Well, I must say that frustration has been building, hasn't it, when certainly Rishi Sunak, when questioned on this in the House on a number of occasions, has said to me that, well, obviously those who are declaring 50,000 are earning over 200. So we know so many people who are bank nurses or bank social workers who are actually on, minimum wages and saying this is not us all, it doesn't reflect us. And people in limited companies who just start making 50,000. So it has been really useful to have that cross-party pressure from all sides of the House. And Paul Blomfield, you'd like to ask a question.
Well, thank you, Tracy. Thanks for organising this morning's event. And I really just wanted to endorse a couple of points that Dan makes, because obviously much of what he was talking about refers to my central Sheffield constituency, where the hospitality sector and its supply chain is key. And it's really just to underline a few points in relation to your meeting with ministers. The point about the way in which so many of those businesses were left hung out to dry during that period we were in tier 2, unable to effectively operate, but equally not supported during that period. And that's had a long-term impact on the viability of those businesses, which needs to be recognised in the sort of targeted support that Dan so rightly pointed to. And the second is some of the, and it kind of echoes Caroline's point in the sense about the way that the government has been blind on the consequences of some of the fixable things it could have done. So, for example, when it shifted the eligibility date in the first lockdown, the problem that they had with the RTI submissions, that could have been sorted. And more recently, as we went into the second national lockdown, the impact that had on new businesses who weren't able to draw down furlough support because they hadn't been for that first week. And yes, it was just a week or slightly a few days more, but it was for new businesses, that lack of support was critical to their business. Those people who'd had the courage to open new businesses during this period, then finding themselves without support when they were forced to close, that could have been addressed by a little bit of flexibility in terms of the eligibility requirements, which excluded them precisely because they were new and hadn't been eligible for the previous scheme. So I think picking up on those points, they're fixable issues, if only the Treasury is minded to do so. But I would also underline the other point that Dan makes about putting this in the wider context. Obviously, we had the Internal Market Bill on the floor of the House yesterday, and much of that is inevitably talking about the political focus is on the issues of rule of law and in the context of the wider talks. But there's a key part of that, which is about the UK Shared Prosperity Fund. Dan and I have both been pushing for the government to put in place the framework within which money is going to be distributed, and to give guarantees to our poorest parts of the country that they are going to be no worse off now we're out of the European Union. And the second thing about that, the other thing about the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, of course, was that money was locally determined. There were European-wide criteria in terms of job creation and economic regeneration, but the actual programmes were set locally, driven locally, and owned locally. And what we've got in all the information we've had so far about the replacement funding is that it's going to be determined in Whitehall with very little consultation, not addressing local needs. And so I think that's a really important point that Dan makes, which if you have the opportunity to raise with ministers while you're looking at the other issues, that would be really helpful too.
I think you're absolutely right, Paul, that Shared Prosperity Fund has to match the EU funds, if not actually build on them. And also the blind spots about the government's response to what seems simple. For example, PAYE freelancers. HMRC has the data for the PAYE. They know it's taken at source, and also they've submitted the accounts for the freelance work. How is it so difficult to put that together to work out someone's payment? These are, like you say, blind spots that potentially came out of responding very swiftly, but then are still left hanging and need response for those people who aren't eligible for support as businesses to then, as individuals, get that support. So thank you for that contribution, Paul. We have now the amazing Rotheram has joined us. Dan, I don't know if you'd like to stay. You'd be very welcome to stay. And I can't see Steve on my screen currently, but if he's here, could you make yourself known, Steve? Just waiting for his image to come up.
Tracy, while you're waiting for Steve,
yes.
Could I just reply to Paul?
Of course, yes. Thank you so much, Dan.
I just want to thank Paul for his comments and actually the brilliant work that he's been doing supporting his businesses in his Sheffield Central constituency. He's been doing a fantastic job. He's absolutely right that we've seen a sort of disappointing lack of flexibility and a kind of a lack of fleet of foot from the Treasury. This isn't in the end all about money. It's partly about money and it's partly about the allocation of resource. But where it gets even more frustrating, perhaps, is where there are measures that the government could be taking that don't actually necessarily cost them money, that they don't either want to or seem able to do. You know, through the combined authority, we've put forward a number of proposals to convert some of our capital investment funding to revenue to provide additional short-term support to our businesses. But the Treasury weren't prepared to support that. But I think Paul's also right that whilst there's a really important piece of work to do in looking how we get through the next few days and weeks, this critical period over Christmas, and we need the government to act urgently on that, we can't also afford to lose sight of the longer term and what comes next. And whilst we're still crunching the numbers for South Yorkshire, it seems absolutely certain that the revised arrangements following on from the end of the Local Growth Fund and the gap before we get to the UK Shared Prosperity Fund will mean that we are hundreds of millions of pounds short compared to where we would otherwise have been just in South Yorkshire alone. That will have a massive impact on our regional economy. The Local Growth Fund has been deployed very successfully in South Yorkshire. It's created and protected thousands and thousands of jobs. It's been the lifeblood of our regional economy, and it will be very, very greatly missed. So I'm still trying to get response from ministers as to what's going to properly fill the gap between LGF and Shared Prosperity Fund. I'm acutely conscious that in the budget back in March, £387 million was allocated specifically to carry over the Local Growth Fund into the next financial year to support our regional economies. We're not quite sure where that money has gone to, but I'm on the case in terms of trying to track it down. So I'm grateful, Paul, to you for today, but also for all the work that you've been doing to support your businesses. It's made a huge difference. So thank you.
Thank you, Dan. And certainly what you're saying, Paul, about how to get over Christmas, when the Trust said only a couple of weeks ago that they've now had a distribution of food packs twice as many as normal, and so many more first-time users because of the impact, I think, of people falling through the gap. And it's only going to get worse, isn't it? So thank you for that. So I can now see the amazing Rotheram. So welcome, Steve, to Gaps in Support. Thank you. Steve was appointed Mayor of Liverpool in 2017 and an active campaigner on the excluded issue, voicing his concerns about the treatment of the Northwest after the furlough scheme was extended until December and the government refused to pay more than 2/3 of the pay of hospitality workers whose businesses were forced shut under the imposed Tier 3 measures. And certainly your quote, Steve, has been used many times that this exclusion is an absolute tragedy on a biblical scale. So many people really feel that pain and suffering, and certainly the mental health crisis that you have been talking about is definitely on its way. And we've already heard the testimonies of people who are really struggling, the pain and anxiety and the mental health crisis coming down the track. So over to you, and Steve, thank you for joining today.
Thanks, Chair. I like you, Tracy. I got involved because quite clearly it's unjust, it's unfair. It's about people who are already suffering but have been abandoned and left behind. And of course, it's about parity and not charity. And that's the thing that we've been trying to consistently say. You know, I do sort of get why early doors, when somebody designs something, it's likely that you're going to have gaps or make mistakes, but they could have been rectified at any stage during the last 8 months. And the groups that we've spoken to, there have been some absolutely harrowing stories. I mean, you know, as a politician, that sometimes people come into your surgeries and they'll tell you stuff and they go, but you can remember them people for years afterwards. You're thinking, oh, about that terrible stuff. And I felt like that when we were going through some of the pen pictures, if you like, that people were painting and illustrating of what's happened in their lives over the last few months when we've had this series of events with both excluded and forgotten. And really, it is now about trying to get the opportunity for these people to sit in front of the Chancellor, because surely he would not be able to refuse those people if he heard what's actually happening in their daily lives. So I always think that when you come up with big numbers, people sort of outside, in the man and woman in the street, it just gets lost on them. 3 million excluded people is a huge number, but if it was 4 million or 2 million, I don't think it's just the quantum. I think it's the problem that people within that large number are experiencing. So the more we can explain that this isn't about people with lots and lots of money, but these are people who are attending food banks, as you've just said, whose lives have been turned around, who, by the way, were doing the right thing, because these were, you know, the people who were going out there and starting businesses and being entrepreneurial and looking at those opportunities, all the things that, you know, this government have told people that they should be doing, they've done it. And then the first opportunity that the government gets to provide the safety net for this group, they pull it away from them and have left them literally floundering. So in our area, we've tried to do what we can do, Chair. Just heard Dan briefly there. I know Dan's doing something, Andy's doing something, and the other, Jamie and other Metro mayors, including Sadiq. We're seeing what we can try to do ourselves. But this doesn't mean that because we're trying to address some of the concerns that the government can step away from the plate. They can't, because ours is a bit of a stick and plaster and it needs some fundamental support. So just to let you know what we're trying to do in our area, I put together a £9.5 million package of support for the Excluded and Forgotten Fund. And it's designed for those small and certainly the micro businesses, including lots of those who've been excluded from the national support schemes, to try and see whether we can prop some of those up. And I've always believed that the way in which we'll get through the next stage, which for me is about recovery, certainly there's rescue at the moment, but about recovery, is to have people who can get back into trading, to have businesses to hit the ground running as quickly as possible. And then you can get through that into growth. And that's where we really were pre-pandemic. We were in a bit of a growth period. We were the fastest growing city region in the whole country. And I want to see whether we can return to that. So we've done this to try and prop up some of those who, those people who have been excluded. And that's on top of a £40 million hospitality fund that we created back in October. And again, that's to assist as many groups as we possibly can to keep the whole economy ticking over. But it can only stretch so far, all of that funding. And again, as I call what Dan was saying, you probably need hundreds of millions of pounds to sort this out in our city region alone. But the government have an opportunity, don't they? That money that's being handed back by large supermarkets, that can be repurposed, and quite quickly we could get some funding out to people, because we now have mechanisms through our local authorities that will enable us to do that. Look, the capacity issues about getting it out as quickly as we'd like to, but that shouldn't stop us from doing the right thing and trying to make a difference. So we'll do what we can, Chair, to do our own little thing, but we need to all collectively continue to put the pressure on government, because it's only Rishi Sunak who can really solve this. And he did say right at the very beginning in March about this, whatever it takes. Whatever it takes is turned into whatever I'll give you. It's not good enough.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you for all the work that you're doing. And certainly Liverpool and the surrounding regions is so renowned for its creative sector, and so many who are not actually limited companies in businesses, who are freelancers, have also missed out on Arts Council funding and also support from government. So I wonder if there's anything that you've put in place to support those freelancers as well.
Yeah, they some of those will be able to access this funding. The problem is £9.5 million to you and I, and to most people out there, sounds an awful lot of money. But when you're talking about 42,000 businesses in the Liverpool City region, many of whom have been impacted by the restrictions, and not just COVID, but by the different tiers and packages of restrictions over all of this 9 months, then it's not going to go an awful long way. And there will be people that we can't help who are out of scope even to us, because the government have put restrictions on the way we're allowed, even through devolution, even the way we are constrained by government parameters of using that money. Surely if we think it's the right thing for our areas, that's what we should be doing. We've got an assurance framework, so we're not spending it on silly things, but the governments have limited our ability to help everybody that would like to. Plus the fact is that the pot's not big enough, but we will be doing that, Chair, yeah.
Understood. And certainly you weren't here at the beginning, Steve, but I was saying that it's a big week for our group because we've got a Westminster Hall debate tomorrow on this subject, and then we are meeting finally the Treasury to come up with solutions. So I wonder if there's anything that you think that could be implemented swiftly, that government, who seem to have been incredibly resistant to helping freelancers, self-employed, limited companies and new starters, so on, what you think they may be more minded to accept.
Flexibility is, isn't it? You know, let us decide locally if we can repurpose some funding to try and plug some of the gaps. Look, it needs national support. Of course it does. There's probably underspend in the original business support package, the COVID business support package from way back in March, April. So maybe that with local authorities could be allowed to be used more flexibly for that money that hasn't been sent back. It could be repurposed, couldn't it? And that might be a very, very quick way in which we could distribute some survival monies, really. That's all it is. We're trying to get people who've had nothing to get through this very difficult period. What a boost that would be for Christmas. And the only thing I'd say about the economics of this is that we were going to give that £2 billion, we as a country, we're going to give that £2 billion to large supermarkets who would have given that to shareholders, and that would have sat in their bank accounts. People now are trying to pay bills and look towards Christmas. If we give that same money to self-employed people and to those freelancers, etc., they will spend that money. You will get an economic hit. It will be Keynesian economics money. It'll regurgitate that funding around the economy, and you'll see a boost for it. It's not going to lie in people's bank accounts because many of them haven't got anything anyway in the bank accounts. So they will be spending that money in local shops, and that will support other businesses. And surely that's the best way in which we can tackle both the individual problem, but also to look towards growth within the economies.
Well, certainly that's a really positive approach, because a vibrant business pays its tax, it pays employees who pay tax, and certainly the devastation on our high street. It would make sense that the entrepreneurs, those new businesses, people who've got the courage to step out of maybe a PAYE job into something that they've always wanted to do, they shouldn't be discriminated against. And certainly, Steve, you were on the call when we were listening to those 6 individuals who spoke about their story. And the one person that stuck with me is the young woman who was teaching empathy to frontline workers, key workers in hospital and in the police. And yet she felt that the government was showing her no empathy when she was living on fresh air. So it was a really profound testimony, and I do wish government ministers would be on those calls. I wonder if there's any questions from my colleagues on the call. Munira, you're the holding the debate tomorrow. So I wonder if you've any thoughts about what you think we should be asking Steve and regional leaders to be doing.
Thank you, and I'm sorry I joined the meeting late, so I missed quite a lot of what Dan said. But I mean, tomorrow's debate is actually quite short, and there's not going to be many of us able to speak, and I'm trying to cover a lot of issues. One of the areas, I mean, I know, Tracy, you've been a massive champion for freelancers, and I've been trying to press their case as well. But one of the areas that I feel has really been overlooked is the directors of limited companies, who've been largely sort of touted as tax dodgers, which is totally unfair. So I'm planning on trying to focus in on some of those issues too. But in terms of what the mayors can do to help us, I think certainly talking to my own local authority, one of the challenges we've got is where there is unused grant money that's been given for businesses, they just simply can't give it to some of these sorts of businesses that are home based because of the criteria that are there in place. There needs to be these sort of fixed costs such as property costs and so on. So I think whether there's anything that can be done, from a local government angle with the support of the mayors to press for some sort of relaxation around those rules, because I think we could potentially unlock some funding there. I mean, I don't know how other local authorities are placed.
Let me ask that question to Steve, because Dan was saying that it's been putting governments for relaxation of capital spend to be able to use some of that. Wondering if that's maybe a strategy you've been thinking of. Steve.
Thanks, Tracy. Yes, it is. I've never really understood why government are so obsessed with this capital and revenue debate. It's money, isn't it? To most people, a pound's a pound. And if you can spend that to protect people, to ensure that businesses are able to continue, that's a good use of that funding. So I think Manera's right. It is about flexibility, and there are very strict and prohibitive criteria around some of the different pots of money, and the money that they got, which is the COVID business support stuff. Yeah, that can be quite onerous. So simplify it. Because we have an assurance framework, the government can come in and audit that to make certain that that money has gone to people. So there's none of this nonsense about it's all going to go to dodgy companies and all that sort of stuff. Well, I wish we'd been more careful with other forms of government support that may well have done that. This won't, but we need to demyth and demystify how we can do this. There's stuff around the directors of small businesses. People are being told that they've had £25,000 each, and that there's loads of money in the system. Some people have had nothing, and it's no good ministers standing up in front of the dispatch box just rehearsing the same tired lines when people have pointed out that that is not the truth of their individual lives.
Thank you for that. And as we are an all-party parliamentary group, I'd like to bring in Esther McVeigh, who has the question for Steve.
Hi there, Tracy. Thank you very much indeed. Sorry, my signal's not great, so you haven't got the visuals there. What I want to say is, very powerful presentations everybody's been given this morning. And I think we all agree those people who have been forgotten need to be remembered ASAP, and we need to get this money distributed to them. So I guess my question to the mayors is, it is about that ease of distribution. And what do you think? Yes, you've been distributing money through the local councils, but what else do you think you can do on top of that to find these people who have not had anything yet? I think we need to give that reassurance to the Treasury that this money can be allocated safely and securely to those people. And I think if we could all work together on that to give that reassurance to the Treasury. I'm meeting with Rishi soon. Apologies, I was a little bit late this morning. I was actually speaking to some of the supermarkets who've handed the money back, but I'd like to be able to give that reassurance to Treasury. We know how we're going to get that money allocated on a regional basis.
That's a really good point, Esther. Thank you. And the fact you're meeting Rishi is really good news, because you weren't here at the beginning. We're also meeting the Treasury on Thursday, so it's a double attack. So I'm very grateful. And I
think we call that a pincer effect.
But also we're talking about solutions today to try and support the government, to try and persuade them that this is straightforward. I don't know, Steve, if you want to comment on what Esther was saying about how to make it easy and to reassure Treasury that we can do this regionally.
I think it's a good point, in all honesty, because we do need to reassure governments that the funding that would be distributed in this instance would do what it says on the tin and get to where it is needed and most needed. And the way you can do that, of course, is through our local authorities. The only thing I'd say to Esther is that we will have some capacity issues because there are so many different strands of funding that councils are expected to distribute, that they're telling us that they're almost in overload, where another one they might just take them over the edge. So that is a part of an issue that we'd have to consider if we were to go down this route. But it can be done, and as other things drop off, that will increase the ability of local authorities to do further things. We need to make it simple and as flexible as we can, but also with that quality assurance that the money won't be squandered, or that the reassurances that government would quite rightly want from us can be captured within that assurance framework. Now, I don't know about individual local authorities, but I can tell you combined authorities all have that assurance framework with central government. So it's a guarantee on that. If we could do the same thing for those areas that don't have assurance frameworks, then I'm certain there's a route in which we could do it quite quickly.
Fantastic, Stephen. I know that you have to go in a moment, but I just wonder if you've got 30 seconds to answer a question from Ludo, who's one of the attendees. How do you envisage the renewed tier system impacting excluded groups in your city region?
Just repeat that, Chair, sorry.
Yeah. How do you envisage the renewed tier system, depending on which way it goes, impacting excluded groups in your city region?
Oh, well, the whole tier thing is quite worrying in all honesty, because we're in tier 2 at the moment. As you know, we're the only area in the whole country that went from a higher tier to a slightly lower tier. But the conditions around our tier status are still quite onerous. There are heavy restrictions in lots of areas, and that means that the opportunity for people over this Christmas period to maximise the festivities within the hospitality sector, for instance, are limited. But we're trying to use our funding not just for the ones who are directly impacted, which in a tier 3 you'd get a block of money for that. So we've done some of that because we were previously in a higher tier. So we've done that. It's the next level down. So it's the supply chain really that's been really hindered, that has had no direct support. So the ones who have had money off government, we can argue it's not enough, but they've had some money. There are people who've had absolutely nothing. So we're looking to see whether we can use our funding, as limited as it is, for those people in the supply chain to hospitality, for instance, the visitor economy, and then the likes of the retail that wasn't forced to close but is affected by it. So there's an awful lot of those in cities, especially where the visitor economy is huge. But it's not going to go anywhere near as far as we need it to go.
And certainly we've no idea, have we, how long these tiers are going to carry on. It may be into next year and into the spring. Steve, thank you so much for taking time to join us. We are now going to take a short break. It's a full morning of fun and festivities here in APPG land. I'm going to take a short break and then come back at 11:45 with Andy Burnham as well. So hopefully you can all re-log in. It's the same log. Come back and we will continue the call, and hopefully at the end consolidate a list of asks, and hopefully Esther and I can work in our pincer movement to get some really good solid outcomes going into Christmas for those people who've really missed out. So thank you for joining so far, and hope to see you in Act 2. Thank you so much, everyone. Andy. Hi there, how are you doing?
Can you hear me, Tracy? I
can. Let me just double check. It's nearly time to go again. You're Act 2. We've had Dan and Steve so far.
Good.
Thank you so much for taking time today.
No
We're
worries.
really grateful.
How's it going, by the way? Are you all set for later this week?
Yeah, well, we'll know on Friday. So it's been a really interesting campaigning digitally, everything online. But
You've done a good job.
Good.
Some great
Yeah,
stuff.
I've learned a lot as well, so that's all good news. I'll just check with the team if they're good to go again. Bear with me. Great stuff. So we're back with the APPG for Gaps in Sport, and thank you everybody who's come back for the second half of this. And can I say thank you, a huge thank you to Andy Burnham. I know that the mayors at the moment are really stretched with time, so we have Andy for 15 minutes, but I'm sure we can make the most of that. So Andy, what we're saying at the moment is that we've got a great week here for excluded and forgotten freelancers and PAYE, because we have a adjournment debate tomorrow on this subject, and we're meeting the ministers on Thursday. So what we're hoping to do is to get some positive solutions to support the government to make the right decision, to walk down the hill with us, and maybe take some of your suggestions and others of how we ensure that we just do something to support those who've been excluded before Christmas. So Andy, welcome to the group, and the floor is yours.
Thanks very much indeed, Tracy, and thanks for the opportunity to speak to you all. I think I want to start just by praising all of the parliamentary colleagues on the call and in the group, because you've done a really important job actually in raising awareness, bringing to people's attention the need to resolve this issue, because there is a big issue here, and I think it just transcends party politics, doesn't it? This is about people in a difficult year. I think you've probably heard from the other mayors today, Tracy, how we have tried to create a platform for the people affected, and had a number of events now, both with excluded and forgotten, and I know there are other groups involved that I shall come on to in a moment. But yeah, we've had events, and the idea was just to give a voice to people, to be able to describe what's happened to them. And I think everyone has said it, quite harrowing really, you know, we just sit and listen and just understand what people have been going through. I think the thing that comes over a lot is, you know, people who contributed, you know, taxpayers, employers, people who've given a lot to the country. I always said after the meetings was, you know, doers, not complainers, probably the kind of people who never thought they'd be in meetings with mayors or MPs, you know, kind of the heartbeat of communities and the backbone of the economy. And I think, you know, it's the sense of not being valued by their country, I think, is kind of come over really strongly to me. And I have a strong sense that we just need to resolve this, so that the country actually can heal a bit next year and kind of come back together, and you know, we can get things moving again. But everyone kind of feels that in the end, justice was done. People were looked after when they needed to be looked after. And at this moment in time, that isn't the case, obviously, and it needs to be the case, I think, so we can draw a line under this horrendous experience that we've all lived with this year. Nobody criticises the Chancellor or the Prime Minister, I don't think, for kind of not getting all of this right at the first time of asking, because, you know, standing up schemes of the scale that they did, you know, was something that no government had to do in our lifetimes before. So inevitably there were going to be gaps. But I guess as the year has gone on, it's become, let's say, less forgivable. I think that, you know, when we know the stories now, that we aren't now doing something as a country to put it right. It seems to me that both we put stuff up at the first instance that left people out. That's clear, but it's also becoming much clearer now that we overpaid some organisations and some people. We've seen the return of business rates relief. But I'm also aware that, you know, there's been a lot of return of furlough funds to HMRC. So furlough funds that have not been used or claimed in error or whatever it might be, and that's over £200 million as well, Tracy. So I kind of, you know, that's, you know, the fact that people were missed out is not a surprise. The fact that people were kind of paid, if you like, in error or without needing it isn't a surprise. But clearly within those two things, there rests the potential now for a solution to help the 3 million or so people who have been excluded from support. I mentioned the groups, and I know we've kind of focused a lot on excluded and forgotten. Excluded obviously covered all of the range of people, but I just want to recognise the refused furlough support group, forgotten PAYE, maternity, the maternity petition, New Starter Justice. There's a lot of people been out campaigning on these things, and I think I've campaigned on a lot of injustices over my time, particularly when I was in Parliament, and I think this one kind of most reminds me in many ways of the terrible scandal of contaminated blood, because what you had there was just people in all parts of the country, all so sort of diffuse and so people's situations so disparate. It was actually hard to get the clarity in the campaign, if I can put it that way. And I think similar here, you know, people's situations are different, they're complex, people are in different areas, and it has taken a while in some ways for the campaign to sort of really come together. But I think it has now come together, and people can see clearly what has happened here, and that is down to the groups concerned, but also the all-party group that has held the ring as well. So the question is now, Tracy, can we move this towards a solution? I think solutions are definitely out there. I don't believe it's too complicated. The question of fraud is often mentioned, but you know, if this was done via HMRC, because as I said at the beginning, these are all taxpayers, and in one way or another, it's possible to have a sense of their earnings, and also the tax system could be used to provide rebates. I think this isn't as complicated as it looks. I think using the tax system allows the fraud question to be dealt with, because obviously if there's an overpayment, that can be reclaimed later down the line in a later year. So it isn't too complicated. I think it's really important that there needs to be a solution for everybody, and a group perhaps we haven't spoken about enough. I mean, I've talked a lot about PAYE freelancers, because many cities like ours, you know, depend so much on the creative and nighttime economy, and there are many people in that position in working in that economy. We've talked about the 50% rule around self-employment, and again, lots of people in our city have fallen foul of that. But let's not forget new starters who were denied furlough, or people who were unfairly or unlawfully even denied furlough by employers. You know, it's really important that we don't, when we look towards a solution, it's got to be a solution for everybody. We don't create a new sense of injustice in the final analysis. So Tracy, I'll leave it there. I don't know if you know, if I hand back to you, people would want to ask any questions from my point of view. I mean, all I would say is good luck to all of the campaign groups and the MPs that are going into the debate this week and into the meeting with ministers. I think, in my experience, campaigns always have a certain sort of kind of energy, and this one feels like it is now coming very much into the spotlight. The cross-party nature of it is crucial. That was crucial on contaminated blood and on Hillsborough and other campaigns that I've worked on. I think there is a will to do something here. People can see the issue now. It is important that it's dealt with quickly. I think Christmas is really a cause of great distress for many families now who are in a sense of a position where they can't see the light at the end of the tunnel. That's why something does need to be done. I would stress the need for something immediately to give people that immediate respite and some hope, particularly with all of the pressures that come with Christmas. But then perhaps further work to be done in the new year to kind of come to a sort of proper solution that might backdate things as well, and put things right going forward. So I maybe would separate it like that, you know, something immediate to be followed on by something that would bring everything back fairly together, and a commitment from the government to that end. But then I'll finish on this point, Tracy. See, I think if we don't do something, I think that we've all got to remember what would be lost in the long run. And I think it would be that sense of unity coming out of crisis, to have 3 million people who forever felt that they contributed all of their life to this country. And in that moment when they couldn't do anything about the change in their circumstances, that the country wasn't there for them, I honestly believe that would leave a really kind of sort of festering situation that wouldn't be good for any of us, actually, you know, within our local areas, but nationally either. It will always be remembered. People would never ever forget that is what happened to them. And I just don't think we should get to a position where we allow that to happen. But the second thing that I've always kind of pointed to as a sort of would be a really unhelpful legacy if this is what happens. It almost sends out an anti-entrepreneurial message, because many of the people in these groups have made changes in their life. They've taken a risk. They've followed a dream. You know, they've tried to create a business, as we were hearing from Forgotten last week, at a kitchen table, and they've kind of like, you know, really put themselves out there. You know, and it's not the case that these are all wealthy company directors. It's hairdressers, it's plumbers, it's people who are just setting up a small business, showing that kind of spirit of wanting to do that. And if we don't do something, it almost says that's too risky. Don't do that anymore, because if you do that, you are really at risk of being completely on your own if something happens that's way beyond your control. And I just think that's a bad message to leave hanging over the country, a very dangerous message to leave hanging over the country at the end of this. So I would just say, you know, the campaigns I've been involved in over the years, I mean, you know, you don't jump. People say, "Oh, jump on bandwagons." Well, actually, not. You know, there's campaigns where you look at them and say, "What's right and what's wrong?" And you know, you can quickly see, can't you, whether there's a real injustice or not. In this case, there is a genuine injustice. No one is necessarily saying it's all the government's fault, because obviously the government's had unprecedented things to deal with. But put that to one side, there is a genuine injustice here that needs to be corrected. That's why these groups will have my support until there is a solution found for them. But I think, you know, this week, all, you know, encouragement to all of you, Tracy, that'll be speaking in the debate tomorrow. I think if you look at some of the stories that were told via the mayor's events, there's so much material there for people to use. People, you know, this is no exaggeration to say jobs, homes, marriages, businesses, lives depend upon a solution. That is not an exaggeration. And I hope people will take the seriousness of that into tomorrow's debate, but also the passion to do something, and into the meeting with ministers. So thank you for having me, Tracy, and I'll hand back to you.
Thank you so much. As always, a very empathetic response to what is an awful crisis. And certainly those testimonies in the mayoral event, 6 extraordinary human stories, really did pull at the heartstrings. I think what you were saying about the loss of sectors as well, 1/3 of musicians saying that they're thinking of leaving for good, for the thing that they've trained for, they've spent their life doing. And certainly it is a loss to all of our community when we lose those entrepreneurs, those innovators, those, you know, business leaders, like you're saying, those kitchen table business. And 95% of notonthehighstreet.com is women. We know also that it impacts on men who are starting out with their business. We have a question from Laura Savage. Have you made any assessment the impact of groups being excluded from the financial support on public health crisis? Because of course this will impact on mental health.
Yes, thanks, Laura. We have. We certainly track the demand for mental health services, and I think it's no surprise to say that it's increased all year. Now, there are many reasons for that, but I think this is one of them. I have said a few times now that I think there is a kind of mental health crisis following the pandemic, and actually that will live with us, I think, for even longer in 2021, possibly than the pandemic, because some of the issues that are being created by the lack of support, the debt, and the things I was saying before about homes and marriages and other things that are resting on this, will be here for the long haul. So I think there is clear evidence that there is a huge demand, and growing for mental health support. I don't think we've seen the full extent of it yet. I think we'd be kidding ourselves if we said that it's all going to evaporate in 2021. It isn't. We are doing some work in Greater Manchester looking at the full impact with regard to the crisis, which we could share with you, Tracy, in the group, if that would be helpful.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks.
Yeah, I do think that you know, this question of the mental health crisis that comes with the economic crisis is a very serious one, particularly if, you know, there are people are going into what will be a very difficult 2021 from an economic point of view, with residual debts and kind of lack of income, no savings, you know, caused by what's happened this year.
Could I just reiterate a question that Caroline asked Dan Jarvis, just because of your experience in government? What do you think the resistance has been? Why do you think this is proving to be so difficult, even with the massive cross-party pressure on government? Why has it been so hard to get a solution?
In my experience, and I'm not denigrating their profession at all, but I'm talking about my experience on contaminated blood, because I had involvement as a minister on that, but also then as a shadow front bench MP, and then finally as a backbencher in my final speech. I am talking about Hillsborough. There are others I could mention as well. I think the civil service starts to adopt a position, doesn't it, around issues, and kind of wants to close them down because of the risks to the wider operation of government. And in this case, the risk would be a financial one, wouldn't it? People would look at 3 million people, they would think, wow, that's how many billions of pounds we're already in. I think that has been the issue, hasn't it? You know, I think the spirit of the early part of the year has changed, I think, as the Treasury has started to sort of face up to public finances going forward. And in one way you can understand that, but in another you can't really, because you can't just draw lines. And, you know, this year has been a case of, it should have been whatever it takes all year, shouldn't it, because of the nature of the year. And I do think what will have happened is, you know, the civil service will have seen the public policy problem coming from the exposure that we've got as a country, and started to sort of kind of pull things back in. Now, the thing I would say is, and I mean this in all seriousness, politicians, in the end, it's our job to intervene again. The system is doing what the system does. And I don't think that implies any inhumanity or cruelty on the part of the system. It just does what it's trained to do, which is mitigate long-term risks to the country. The issue is, this is where politicians come in, and it particularly is where ministers come in. You know, we represent the human side of things. You know, we're there to sort of stand up for justice and fairness within that system. You know, the big machine of government. We're the only ones, in fact, who can bring that humanity into that and tell those stories to those civil servants. And the question is, you have kind of, it all rests on a small number of individuals who have to say to that machine, no, we're going to do something. And it's not an easy thing to do. And I'll be absolutely honest with you, I learnt it late in my parliamentary career, to use the power that's vested in you as a Minister of the Crown. But you're there for a reason. You are there to have that courage and that confidence, sometimes to say, no, you know, this isn't right, something needs to change here. And, you know, that in the end of the day is what needs to be done. And I don't imply any criticism of any minister so far in saying that. You know, everyone is, well, most people are sort of 1 year into their cabinet careers here. I certainly wouldn't, in my first year in the cabinet, have been ready to just say, no, you're going to do, you know, I learned how to do it in time. But I think this is the feature of this current government. It's having to learn things very, very quickly. And I think this is a moment really now to sort of say, actually, if you, in your heart of hearts as a minister, if you know it would be wrong to leave 3 million people out in the cold, you've got to bring them in, and only you can bring them in. And somehow MPs from all sides have got to give them the strength to do that and the encouragement to do that. And that is the best answer I can give you, Tracy, in terms of, you know, my experience.
But that's fantastic. Thank you so much, Andy. And it's a great reflection to end the session on. I know your time is limited, so thank you for taking time out to speak to us. And no pressure on Esther McVeigh, who is got a meeting with Rishi Sunak later this week. We're all on the same page, trying to make a difference for those 3 million people. So thank you, everybody, for taking the time to come on the call from 10 o'clock today. It's been a really good start to the week. We have a lot to do, and we make those arguments with our colleagues, with opposition colleagues, and we will hopefully try and move the ship very gradually towards support for those who are really facing a really tough Christmas. But we continue doing our job. Thank you so much, Andy, for leading the way, and retrospectively thank Steve and Dan as well for being part of the call today. So thank you for all you do. Thank you for joining us today, and do or tweet the Westminster Hall debate tomorrow, and if you can't get in, and just share the word that we're doing our very best for those excluded groups. Thanks so much, everybody. Thanks, Andy. Appreciate it.